To the choir master, at 42 to Dothan, a psalm of David. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him, like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. Selah. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Selah. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. For you will render to a man according to his work. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In verse 1, the psalmist says something that is actually remarkable. We skip over it, but just look again. It says, for God alone my soul waits in silence. How can a soul wait in silence under such pressure? If you're anything like me, then you've got a toolbox somewhere at home in the shed. Mine's in the cupboard under the stairs. And many of the tools in there come out occasionally. Got a really handy screwdriver that can kind of turn around and it's got basically all the bits you need. And then other tools which, although extremely useful, have never even come out of the packet. I had an axe hanging on the back of the inside door of the cupboard under the stairs, and it had been there for like well over a year, and I'd never even taken it out from its little protective thing. And then finally the other day I took it out. We very often leave perfectly good, and in fact our best and most useful tools in the box. And I think Psalm 62 is providing us with one such tool. The Christian life, as you will well know, whether you've been a Christian for a short time or a long time, involves difficulties. All life, everyone's life, whether they're Christian or not, involves difficulties. But when we know Christ, those difficulties are somehow different. We know that he is for us. We know that our condemnation is gone. Why then is it that we suffer so? Why is it that we suffer such particular and acute pain of being opposed, persecuted, shut out? Often our difficulties are very deep and draining. Often they are very long and very painful. Have you ever thought that the life of Jesus very clearly involved many such pains and sorrows? He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. His sorrows and sufferings were not just condensed into and done with in a very short time in the last few hours of his life. No, his whole life was in many ways a life of danger, precariousness, and grief. There's someone at the door, which if someone could just go and open them in. At the same time as Jesus experienced that intense suffering, is it not striking how the character of Jesus that we read of in the Gospels maintained this perfect quietness and calm? We see at the same time his pouring out of grief and sorrow, and also his quietness, even his silence. Well, I think in Psalm 62, Jesus teaches us the tool, the secret to this peaceful, quiet soul. The great preacher Charles Spurgeon calls it the only psalm, not because it's the only psalm, there are 149 other ones, but because the word only is repeated so many times in this psalm. At least 5 times the word alone or only comes. The concept of something being the only thing comes a few more times in the psalm. What is the only thing for the psalmist? Well, it is God. What is the secret then to a peaceful and quiet soul? Well, here's a first part of the secret: how not to be disturbed by enemies, from verses 1 to 4. In verses 3 to 4, we see that the psalmist, David, Jesus as the true singer of the Psalms, was under attack. Apparently, it was a violent attack, whether literally violent, threatening actual death as it was at times for David, as it was, of course, for Jesus, or whether just in a sort of metaphorical picture way. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? Wonder if you've ever had the unique pleasure of kicking down a fence that's sort of already leaning over, or a wall that's damaged. Perhaps you've done some remodeling or demolition work. It is quite a fun thing when you think it's just all it is going to need is one kick and it'll be down. Well, that's the picture here, but it's not a fun thing because it's a person who they're seeking to kick down. Well, they think it's fun. In fact, verse 4, it's their only interest. Their focus, their big one priority is planning to thrust him down from his high position. Whatever it takes, whatever lies, it'll be a pleasure to them to take down this righteous psalmist. Both Jesus and David, the writer of this psalm and its true singer, experienced in their lives extraordinary precariousness. We perhaps skip over it in the Gospels because we think, oh, Jesus kind of just wandered through life. He wandered through life as a homeless person. He was that precarious that he was entirely reliant on day-to-day donations. He had nowhere to lay his head, as he said. Throughout his ministry, he was very close to being destroyed. I mean, throughout it, from beginning to end. In Luke chapter 4, the beginning of Jesus's public ministry, he stands up in the synagogue, says that it's speaking about him, and immediately they seek to put him to death and to stone him. That's the very start of his public ministry. In fact, wind back even further than that to what happens after the Christmas story, the part we never get to, and maybe it's just as well at Christmas time because it's such a horrible story, and how he was so brutally pursued and persecuted, even as a baby, that his family had to flee the country. Throughout his life, throughout his public life, Jesus was under threat. And that, I think, wears on a person. His enemies saw that he was right on the edge, just one kick, and he'll be down. How can one live not disturbed by enemies like that persistent, in a situation of that kind of fragility? Well, the answer is find something solid. And the only solid thing is God. Verse 2, He only is my rock and my salvation. My fortress, I shall not be greatly shaken. He is a castle. He is a great, huge lump of rock that's been there for ever so many thousands of years and never really will be chipped away from what it currently is. That's what God is like. When we see the great tors on Dartmoor or the great cliffs at the coast, we have to think God is a rock as solid as that. Actually, leave the one about the coast aside, because, like at Sidmouth and stuff, they're not actually very solid rocks. It's only God who is that solid. Now, we very quickly, in trying not to be disturbed by enemies, think, well, I need more than just God. We look for alternative help. We look for alternative sources of security, alternative anchor points, thinking, well, at least if that one lets me down, then I've got another one. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Or more often, we just despair. We think, my destruction is inevitable. I'm a tottering wall, a fence that's about to be knocked down. I've no hope. We look at the power and persistence of our enemies and think, how can I possibly survive it? Have you ever considered that the devil really only has one interest in the world? He's like laser focused on doing one thing, which is destroying Christians. He really is focused and powerful on that task. If that's his only interest, how can we resist him when we're so flimsy? Or how? How can we not even be disturbed by an enemy like that? We must recognize that if God is on our side, what can even the most powerful enemies really achieve? Verse 2 says, He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. In the lips of Jesus, that's a wonderful thing to say. Even his violent persecution, suffering, and death is described as not greatly shaken. And in fact, if something's not greatly shaken to the extent that after the shaking ends, it's not shaken at all. Which is why when we come on to verse 6, it says the same thing, I shall not be shaken. How not to be disturbed by your enemies when you're so flimsy and they're so powerful and they're so persistent? Or to realize that with the solid rock of God, you actually cannot be shaken. So that's the first thing, how not to be disturbed by enemies. Secondly, and we're skipping over, we'll come back to the middle of the psalm. So this is from verses 9 to 12. How not to be ensnared by riches. I said that just a moment ago that when we're faced with trouble, often we think, yes, I'll trust in God and I'll put my hope in him. I'll peg my future on him. I'll put one anchor point in him. But just to make sure that I'm safe, I'll make sure I've got a few other anchor points as well. And the typical alternative help we'll look for really comes down to power or money. But God says in verse 9, those of low estate are but a breath, those of high estate are a delusion. People with power, people we think might be able to help us, get us out of jail, bail us out. People with big bank accounts that might be able to rescue us in a real time of need. Those people are a breath. That word breath is the same word often translated as vanity, vanity of vanities, as it says at the start of Ecclesiastes. Whether you're a rich person or a poor person, whether the people you rely on and hope will help you are the most powerful people in the city or somebody very insignificant, they're the same. They weigh the same on the grand scale of humanity. Now, unfortunately, because the type of weighing scales we use nowadays, it's sort of slightly is lost on us. This image here in verse 9, it says, in the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. That's referring to the old style of scales where you put the weights on one side and then whatever you wanted to weigh on the other side. And if it wasn't heavy enough, what you wanted to weigh, then it would just go up like that. You've got to imagine it, children especially, if you've never seen scales like that. You've got to imagine it, one of those digital scales, and you put the thing on it and it still says zero. They're nothing. They're a breath, they're a feather. Even if you've got this super little, like, I've got some super kind of sensitive scales. They have kind of weird patterns on them. I think they're designed for drug dealers, but that's not why I've got them. Even if you put them on that, they're nothing. Both ill-gotten gains, extortion and robbery, and legitimate riches that increase, both of them are a danger and a temptation and a snare if we put our trust in them. Verse 10, put no trust in extortion. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. And verse 8, you'll see the same words, trust in him, but pour out your heart before him. They're the alternatives, and it's saying you can't have both. You can't put your trust in both. You can't say, I want my anchor in God, but I got my backup here. With God, you need no backup. With God, if you're going to have God, you can have no backup. It must be him only if you want to wait in silence, in peace, in quietness. Now, I want to suggest that this is something very, very easy to fall into, particularly in a time of world historically prosperous living. And we may think of ourselves as not particularly prosperous, but certainly of all the people in history, we must be in the top 1% or less. Do we put our trust in what's in our bank balance, or in our wallet, or in our pension pot, or in an insurance policy, or in safety nets that we think we can rely on, whether from individuals or from powerful state forces? All those things are good things, gifts that God has given us. If they are an object of our trust, if we're saying, look, I've got a bit of an anchor in God, but I need an anchor in that as well to make sure I'll be okay. You can't have both. At least you can't have both and the silence and peace and quiet that the psalmist has. It must be God only, the only psalm. Why? Well, verse 11 says, once God has spoken, twice I've heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. The truth is that only God is truly powerful in himself. Remember, the most powerful people in the world, those of high estate, think of the people you read about on the news. You put them on your little tiny scale that you got off Amazon that has a skull on the front of it for some reason. They are zero. And God is everything. He alone, on the other side of the scale, is powerful in himself. In other words, why do you need to entrust yourself to political protection or financial might? Let me make clear again what I'm saying. It's not that either of those things are a bad thing. It was a great thing. It has been a great thing for the Christian faith to have the political protection of powerful people, the emperor or the king. It is a blessing and a help to store up for the future in a pension pot or otherwise. But is that our trust? Are we thinking that weighs something, that is solid enough for me to put a pin in and I'll be safe? It's a nothing. It's a nothing compared with the Lord. Why entrust ourselves to political protection, financial protection? So how is it that we must not be ensnared by riches or by power? Well, we have to recognize what the psalmist says here, that all human power and wealth is a breath, a vanity. It weighs nothing. And that God, on the other hand, if I can put it this way, weighs everything. You may be thinking, well, hang on, you haven't actually given us the secret yet. What is this secret to a life of peace and quiet and waiting in silence, as the psalmist says, even in our hardships? Well, here's the practical secret, and that's why I've left it till last, from the middle of the psalm in verse 5 through to verse 8, the practical how-to. In the Psalms, I think we've seen over the weeks that we've been looking at them that there are basically three characters. There are a few other minor characters that come in. Besides God, there are three characters. There's the king, the singer of the psalm, there's his enemies, and this character doesn't come up very much, but it's definitely there, there's the people. And here we see in this psalm all three. The king is the singer, a psalm of David, for God alone my soul waits in silence. The enemies are those, verse 3, who are attacking a man, who bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. And what about the people? Well, there they are. There we are in verse 8. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. I want you just to pay attention to who's speaking there and to whom. This is the king, the psalmist, speaking to the people and exhorting them, encouraging them to trust in him at all times, to pour out their heart before him, and then identifying him and them together, saying, God is a refuge for us. In other words, all the things that David, all the things that the psalmist, all the things that Jesus says in this psalm of himself, that he is my rock, my salvation, my fortress, my refuge. He's saying, God is a refuge for us. Join me, says Jesus, in trusting only in God. Christ, the psalmist, it was for him, and him only, really, that God alone was his rock and salvation and hope and fortress and refuge and strength. And so he, even in his afflictions, had a peaceful and quiet soul as he waited in silence. Which I think makes verse 8 a very precious verse for us, his people. Jesus addresses this to us. Let me read it again. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Here's the practical how-to. Here's the tool that we so often leave in the cupboard under the stairs. The main thing I want you to remember and to do and to resolve, to pour out your heart before him. This, I think, is the actual practical secret to a quiet heart, to waiting in silence, even in the midst of horrible afflictions. To gather up your worries and temptations and fears, fill them up as you would fill up a bucket full of rubble, and pour it out before him. It means that it's actually not enough just to acknowledge the fact, to accept the kind of theological premises that I've said about the fact that God weighs more than other powers, about the fact that God only can be the deliverer and saviour of our souls. It's not enough just to admit those things and to sort of tick a box in our mind to say, yes, I assent to that. No, the true logic of for God alone my soul waits in silence is that we actually have to engage our soul. We must pour out our soul until there is nothing left for us to say but you alone, he alone. Often we will find that in our darkest times, times in hospital, times of losing a loved one, times of some other great sadness and misery in our lives, that somehow that becomes a great source of spiritual growth and refreshment to us. I think the reason for that is that very often in those situations, we're forced to do this. The very emotion and desperateness of it forces us to actually pour out our soul, to actually go before the Lord and not just say our prayers because we have to, but to pour out every drop of our sorrows and sufferings and uncertainties and doubts to the Lord until there's nothing left but you alone. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. Jesus himself is our example in this. He is the one who so often, even in the midst of staggeringly busy ministry, would go off into the hills by himself and pray to the Lord, pouring out his soul, saying to the Lord, you alone. That's why it says in verse 8, trust in him at all times. At all times. This is not speaking about a one-off, maybe the great one single crisis of your life. Well, then maybe I'll wait for that moment to pour out my soul. It's saying, no, whether you are, in fact, in great time of great riches and prosperity, or whether you're in a time of real precarity, whether you are weak or strong, whether you're facing peace or trouble, we must trust in him, pour out our hearts before him, and say, God is a refuge for me, as he is a refuge for our great, perfect Saviour, the true singer of the Psalms. Make this then not only a one-off practice, one thing that you do when comes back to your mind when you've faced some desperate situation, but a regular, repeated, intentional practice throughout your life, to pour out everything until you're forced to say, you alone, you're all I have, and you're all I need. That is the secret that Jesus is teaching us, that Jesus exemplifies, that the psalm unfolds for us, to being able to say verse 1, for God alone, my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation.